breathing through a gas mask is loud. It is the only sound you hear until something else screams. That rhythmic wheeze of filtered air becomes a metronome for your anxiety, counting down the seconds until your luck runs out. I was 3 miles inside the Urban Deadzone, an area the military firebombed 6 months ago to contain the spread. And the silence here was heavier than the concrete slabs crushing the streets. The smell was the first thing to hit me even through the filters. Not the rot of the dead, I am used to that. This was ozone. High-voltage electricity and antiseptic chemicals cooking in the humid heat of a decaying city. My Geiger counter on my belt clicked once, a sharp report that made me freeze. Then silence again. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, feeling the cold steel against my gloves. The building loomed ahead, a brutalist concrete fortress untouched by the firebombing that had leveled the residential district. The sign above the reinforced glass doors was cracked but legible. The Center for Infectious Disease Control. A place that did not exist on any map I had looted from the National Guard checkpoints. This was a black site. And if the rumors whispered over the encrypted radio frequencies were true, this was where the outbreak started. I moved low, keeping to the shadows of the wrecked cars, my boots crunching softly on shattered glass. Every noise sounded like a gunshot in this dead air. I checked my corners. Clear. I reached the entrance, the glass spiderwebbed with bullet holes from the inside out. Someone had tried to shoot their way out of here. I gripped the handle of the service door, rusted and jammed. With a grunt, I leveraged my crowbar into the gap. Metal screeched against metal, a sound that echoed down the desolate avenue. I froze, waiting for the shuffle of feet, the guttural moans of the infected. Nothing. Just the wind whistling through the hollowed-out skyscrapers. I pushed through into the lobby. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the gloom. The reception desk was overturned, papers scattered like dry leaves. Behind it, the elevators were pry-opened, the shafts yawning into darkness. That smell of ozone was stronger here, mixed with something metallic. Blood. Old dried blood. I raised my rifle, clicking the safety off. The tactical light mounted on the barrel cut a cone of harsh white through the shadows. There were drag marks on the floor. Thick smears leading toward the secure wing. I followed them. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm against the calm wheeze of my mask. I was walking into the belly of the beast, and I had a feeling the beast was not dead, just sleeping. I stepped over a security guard's corpse, skeletal remains still clad in riot gear. His skull was fractured. Not by a bite, but by a blunt object. Human violence. The desperation of the final days. The corridor ahead was lined with containment labs, the glass thick and reinforced. Inside the first one, the emergency lights were still flickering, casting a strobe effect on the cages. Empty cages. Broken cages. Whatever they were keeping in there had gotten out long before the bombs fell. I saw a clipboard on the floor and knelt to retrieve it. The date on the last entry was 2 days before the official news broke. They knew. They knew, and they sealed the doors. I tucked the log into my pack and kept moving. The deeper I went, the colder it got. The air handling units were dead, but a draft was pulling from the lower levels. A sub-basement. That is where the power was coming from. That is where the ozone smell originated. I reached the stairwell door, painted with biohazard warnings. It was slightly ajar. I put my hand on the metal, feeling a vibration. Machinery. Running deep underground. I took a breath, tasted the stale rubber of my mask, and pushed the door open. The darkness below seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight hole. I took the first step down, the metal grating creaking under my weight. This was it. The source. I descended into the dark, leaving the sunlight of the dead city behind. The silence inside the Asclepius Research Center wasn't the empty kind. It was the holding breath kind. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet of a sealed tomb where the air hadn't cycled in 6 months, tasting of copper, ozone, and the sickly sweet underlying rot that permeated every inch of the Urban Deadzone. I eased the hydraulic door shut behind me, the heavy steel latching with a dull thud that vibrated through the soles of my boots. My breath fogged the visor of my gas mask, a rhythmic condensation that obscured the ruin of the lobby. I wiped it clear with a gloved hand, gripping my pry bar until my knuckles turned white. This wasn't a grocery store run or a pharmacy raid. This was ground zero for the botched containment effort. And the rumors whispered around the campfire back at the settlement suggested this was where the virus had decided to stop just killing and start changing. I stepped over the first body. It was desiccated, wearing the tactical vest of a private military contractor. The flesh hadn't rotted off. It had seemingly evaporated, leaving parchment-tight skin over bone. This was the first sign that the dead zone played by different rules. Scavenging here required a surgeon's precision. I wasn't looking for cans of beans. I was hunting for the tech and the chemistry that the old world had died trying to protect. I moved to the reception desk, vaulting over the marble counter. The computer terminals were dead, screens smashed, but the manual logbooks were still there, dusted with pulverized drywall. I flipped through the pages, the paper brittle. The last entries weren't names, they were sector lockdowns. Biocontainment Level 4 sealed. Subject 89 breach. Structural integration observed. Structural integration. 2 words that shouldn't belong together in a medical report. I pocketed the logbook. Information was currency if I made it back, a warning if I didn't. I moved toward the stairwell, bypassing the elevators that were essentially metal coffins waiting to drop. The emergency lights flickered, casting strobe-like shadows that made the debris on the floor seem to writhe. Down here, the air grew colder, but the smell intensified, a chemical burn in the nostrils that bypassed the charcoal filters of my mask. On the second floor, the pathology labs, I found my first prize. A shattered supply cabinet, overlooked by the panicked evacuation. Vials of broad-spectrum antibiotics, the kind that didn't just stop an infection but nuked it. I swept the glass into my pack, wrapping the vials in rags to silence the clinking. Every noise here was a dinner bell. As I moved deeper into the facility, the architecture began to look wrong. It wasn't just the destruction of combat. It was an organic intrusion. Thick black tendrils, like vascular veins made of tar, ran along the ceiling pipes, pulsating with a sluggish rhythm. The infection wasn't just in the blood of the walkers anymore. It was colonizing the building. I crouched near a smashed observation window. Inside the clean room, a centrifuge sat on a table, and next to it, a corpse that had fused with the chair. The black veins connected the body to the floor, anchoring it. This was the evolution. The virus was no longer content with mobile vectors. It was building a hive. I needed a sample. It was suicide, but the settlement's doctor had begged for tissue from a Phase 2 site. I produced a scalpel from my belt, my hand trembling slightly. Not from fear, I told myself, but from the adrenaline cocktail flooding my system. I entered the clean room. The air was thick with spores, visible motes dancing in the beam of my tactical light. I approached the fused corpse. The skin had hardened into a chitinous shell, gray and cracked like dried river mud. I brought the scalpel down to carve a section of the arm, but the moment the blade touched the calcified flesh, the room shifted. A low, wet gurgle erupted from the walls. Not from the corpse, but from the biomass connecting it to the building. The veins on the ceiling tightened, leaking a viscous black fluid. Then, the corpse's head snapped up. There were no eyes, just smooth, bone-like plates where the sockets should have been. It didn't need to see. It sensed the vibration of my pulse. The thing let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal, tearing itself free from the chair with a sickening wet rip. It didn't shambles, it uncoiled. The limbs were elongated, joints swollen with bulbous growths. I scrambled back, raising my pry bar as it lunged. This wasn't the mindless hunger of the early days. This was predatory efficiency. It swiped, and I barely ducked, the clawed hand gouging deep into the steel doorframe behind me. Sparks showered down. I swung the bar, connecting with its shoulder. It felt like hitting a concrete pillar. The vibration jarred my arm to the shoulder, but the impact cracked the chitinous armor. Black ichor sprayed out, sizzling where it hit the floor. Acidic blood. Just another lethal adaptation. I kicked a rolling cart between us, creating a momentary barrier. The creature didn't go around. It smashed through, tossing the heavy equipment aside like it was cardboard. I needed distance. I bolted for the hallway, my boots skidding on the slick floor tiles. The shriek echoed behind me, joined now by other sounds from the floors above and below, a chorus of awakening. I had rung the dinner bell for the entire facility. I sprinted toward the secure storage wing, hoping the heavy maglocks were still disengaged. The layout on the wall map I'd memorized showed a hazmat shower and an emergency exit in Sector 4. I just had to get there without being dissolved or dismembered. I slid around a corner and slammed into a dead end. A security gate dropped during the lockdown. Through the mesh, I could see the exit signs glowing green, a cruel mockery of safety. Behind me, the heavy, uneven footsteps of the Phase 2 mutation grew louder. I scanned the walls. An override panel. I jammed the pry bar into the seam, wrenching the metal casing off. Wires spilled out. I didn't know the code, but I knew physics. I slashed the power conduit with the sharp end of the bar. Sparks exploded, blinding me for a second, but the gate groaned and ratcheted upward a few feet before jamming. Enough. I dove under the gap, my backpack catching on the metal teeth of the gate. I thrashed, pulling hard, hearing the rip of fabric. I rolled through just as the creature slammed into the other side. It reached through, its elongated fingers snapping inches from my boot. I scrambled back, panting, watching as it gripped the reinforced mesh and began to pull. The steel groaned. It was strong enough to tear the gate down, given time. And time was the one resource I was fresh out of. I checked my pack. The antibiotics were safe. The sample container, miraculously, was still in my pocket, though I couldn't remember when I'd managed to grab the tissue. Maybe survival instinct was faster than conscious thought. The hallway ahead was lined with more of the black biomass, but here it was dormant, gray and flaky. I moved fast, keeping my weapon raised. The scavenging run had turned into an escape mission, but as I passed the open doors of the genetics lab, I saw something that made me stop dead. Rows of tanks. Inside them weren't people, but organs. Massive, independent hearts and lungs, suspended in yellow fluid, all connected by the black veins. The virus wasn't just mutating the hosts. It was trying to create a sustainable biology independent of the human form. It was learning to live without us. I raised my camera, snapping 3 grainy photos before the battery warning flashed. This was the intel that mattered. The dead weren't just walking, they were farming. They were building a new ecosystem on the bones of the old one. I reached the emergency exit, the mechanism rusted but functional. I threw my weight against the crash bar, and the door screamed open, spilling me out into the alleyway. The sunlight was blinding, a stark contrast to the gloom of the medical tomb. I fell to the asphalt, gasping, the filtered air of the outside world tasting sweet despite the pollution. I looked back at the heavy steel door. It rattled once, a heavy thud from the other side, and then went still. I checked my gear. Half my water was gone, my pry bar was bent, and I had a deep bruise forming on my shoulder. But I had the meds, I had the sample, and I had the truth. The infection was evolving faster than we could kill it. As I limped away from the research center, merging into the shadows of the ruins, I realized the terrifying reality of the Urban Deadzone. We thought we were the survivors fighting a dying plague. We were wrong. We were the invasive species, and the planet's new immune system was just getting started. The pneumatic hiss of the airlock unsealing sounded like a dying breath, echoing too loudly against the sterile white tiles of the Xenon Medical Institute's lobby. I stepped inside, the beam of my tactical light cutting through air thick with suspended dust and the cloying metallic scent of dried blood mixed with industrial bleach. This was the heart of the Urban Deadzone, a sector walled off by the military 3 months ago, and this facility was ground zero for the rumors. They said the infection didn't just start here. They said it was being engineered here. I wasn't here for the history, though. I was here for the loot. My respirator clicked rhythmically, a metronome counting down the time I had before the filters gave out. The lobby was a massacre frozen in time. Gurneys were overturned, their wheels rusting in the stagnant air, and the floor was a mosaic of shattered glass and dark, crusty stains. I stepped over a corpse clad in private security armor. His ribcage had been cracked open, not gnawed, but pried apart with immense force. I crouched, checking his pockets. Nothing but a dead radio and a half-empty magazine for a sidearm I didn't own. I moved on, pushing deeper into the facility. My target was Sublevel 3, Virology and Containment. The schematics I'd bartered 3 weeks' worth of rations for indicated that the emergency caches down there would hold military-grade antibiotics and epinephrine, liquid gold in the wasteland. But as I descended the emergency stairwell, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, heavier. The graffiti on the walls stopped at the second floor. Below that, there was only silence and claw marks gouged into the concrete, deep enough to expose the rebar. Reaching the landing of Sublevel 3, I found the blast door slightly ajar, jammed by a severed arm that had fused with the metal. I paused, listening. The moans of the infected usually drift through ventilation shafts, a constant background noise of the apocalypse, but here, it was dead silent. I squeezed through the gap, my hazmat suit scraping against the cold steel. The hallway beyond was bathed in the crimson pulse of auxiliary emergency lighting. Shadows stretched and contracted with every strobe flash, playing tricks on my peripheral vision. I kept my shotgun raised, stock pressed tight against my shoulder. The first room was a triage center. It was here that I saw the first sign that the infection was changing. Lying on a stainless steel table was a subject, strapped down with heavy leather restraints. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't decaying either. The skin had turned a translucent gray, pulled taut over muscles that looked hypertrophied, swollen beyond human limits. I moved closer, compelled by a morbid curiosity. Where a normal infection caused necrosis and rot, this subject showed signs of integration. Black veins pulsed slowly beneath the skin, creating a lattice of biological wiring. The fingernails had lengthened and hardened into keratin spikes, resembling talons more than human digits. This wasn't death, it was evolution. The virus wasn't just killing the host, it was rebuilding it for efficiency. I shivered, backing away. The intel was wrong. This wasn't a research center anymore, it was a cocoon. I pressed forward, towards the cold storage vault. The floor became sticky, coated in a resin-like substance that smelled of ammonia. I tried to step lightly, the squelch of my boots sounding like gunshots in the quiet. I reached the vault. The keypad was dead, but the magnetic lock had failed. I pried the heavy door open and was hit by a wave of freezing mist. Inside, racks of vials sat undisturbed. I unslung my pack, hands trembling as I began to shovel boxes of broad-spectrum antivirals and pain inhibitors into the bag. I found a hardened case marked with a biohazard symbol and Project Chimera stenciled in red. I didn't know what it was, but anything classified was worth trading. I shoved it in. Then I heard it. A chittering sound. Like insects, but wet and heavy. It came from the ceiling. I froze, slowly angling my flashlight upward. Above me, clinging to the ventilation ducts, was something that used to be a man. Its limbs were elongated, the joints reversed like an arachnid. Its jaw had unhinged, splitting down the center to reveal rows of needle-like teeth that glistened in the beam of my light. It didn't have eyes, just smooth, pale skin where the sockets should have been. It had adapted to the dark. It tracked me by sound. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs, so loud I was sure the creature could hear it. I slowly reached for the flashbang on my belt. The creature hissed, its head cocking to the side, skeletal fingers flexing against the metal duct. The resin on the floor, it was a nest. I was standing in a hive. The realization hit me the same moment the creature lunged. I ripped the pin and threw the flashbang, diving behind a metal shelving unit. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, a brilliant white supernova that banished the red gloom. The creature shrieked, a sound that wasn't human, a high-pitched frequency that made my teeth ache. I scrambled up, shotgun raised, and fired blindly into the white smoke. The recoil bruised my shoulder, the boom thunderous. I heard a wet thud, followed by thrashing. I didn't wait to check the kill. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the slick floor. The chittering wasn't singular anymore. It was a chorus. From the shadows of the triage room, from the vents, from the cracks in the ceiling, they were coming. The evolved ones? The hunters. I sprinted back towards the blast door, the weight of my pack threatening to overbalance me. A shape dropped from the ceiling in front of me, a smaller one, fast and wiry. It swiped at me, its talons tearing through the outer layer of my suit. I slammed the butt of my shotgun into its face, feeling bone crunch, and vaulted over it. I squeezed through the jammed blast door, the metal biting into my suit, and kicked the severed arm free. The heavy door groaned but didn't close. They were right behind me. I could hear their limbs striking the metal floor, a rapid-fire tapping of bone on steel. I hit the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. My lungs burned, the respirator struggling to supply enough air. As I reached the 2nd floor, a hand punched through the drywall next to my head, gray, muscular, and terminated in claws. They were in the walls. The infrastructure of the building had become their transit system. I burst into the lobby, the sunlight filtering through the grime of the front doors looking like salvation. I didn't stop until I was 3 blocks away, collapsed in an alleyway behind a dumpster. I ripped the mask off, gasping for unfiltered, smoggy air. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip the bag closed. I checked the tear in my suit. Shallow. No blood. I was lucky. I looked at the hall, enough medicine to buy a way out of the city, maybe even into a safe zone. But as I stared at the Project Chimera case, the dread settled back in. The things in that basement weren't mindless zombies. They were predators. They were adapting to the environment, to the dark, to us. We were scavenging for scraps of the old world, thinking we could outlast the dead. But the dead weren't just waiting to rot. They were getting better at killing us. I realized then that the walls around the Urban Deadzone weren't there to keep us out. They were there to keep the future in. The heavy steel doors of the Genesis Research Center groaned in protest as I forced the crowbar into the seam. The screech of metal on metal echoing like a dinner bell through the silent street. I paused, holding my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The Urban Deadzone was never truly quiet. There was always the distant wail of wind through shattered skyscrapers or the shifting of settling debris, but the silence here was heavy, artificial. I waited for the shambling gait of the infected, but nothing came. With a final, grunting heave, the magnetic lock shattered, and the doors slid open just enough for me to slip through. The air inside was stale, recycled 10 years ago and left to rot. It smelled of ozone, old paper, and the copper tang of dried blood. I clicked on my tactical light, the beam cutting through the dust motes dancing in the stagnant atmosphere. The lobby was a tomb. The reception desk was overturned, monitors smashed, papers scattered like autumn leaves. But it was the walls that caught my attention. They weren't just dirty. They were stained with a black, resinous substance that seemed to grow out of the ventilation ducts, veining across the plaster like ivy. This wasn't just decay. This was terraforming. I kept my weapon, a battered suppressed carbine, tucked tight into my shoulder. My objective was the sub-basement pharmacy. But in a place like this, you scavenge everything. You don't leave calories or chemistry behind. I swept the reception area. Under the desk, clutching a rusted sidearm, lay a skeleton in a security uniform. I checked the mag, 3 rounds. Better than nothing. I pocketed them, along with a half-empty bottle of hand sanitizer. Alcohol is fuel, cleaner, and currency. The elevators were dead, their shafts gaping maws into the dark. I took the stairs, the concrete cold enough to seep through the soles of my boots. As I descended to the second floor, the pathology labs, the black resin grew thicker. It coated the handrails, slick and slightly warm to the touch. I avoided it. We'd heard rumors in the settlement about the infection changing, evolving away from the simple reanimation of dead tissue into something distinct. Something unified. I didn't want to believe it, but the biomatter pulsing faintly on the walls made denial impossible. Level 2. The door to the main lab had been barricaded from the outside. Chairs, desks, filing cabinets piled high. Someone had tried to keep something in. I climbed over the debris, my movements slow, deliberate. Inside, the lab was a freeze frame of panic. Microscopes toppled, centrifuges left open. But the containment cells along the back wall were the focal point. I approached the reinforced glass of cell 3. The creature inside was long dead, or at least dormant. It was slumped in the corner, but it didn't look like the shamblers up on the surface. The skin hadn't sloughed off, it had calcified. Plates of bone-like growth covered the chest and forearms, interlocking like medieval armor. The fingers had fused together into singular, jagged spikes. This wasn't rot, it was fortification. The virus wasn't just keeping the host moving anymore, it was optimizing it for combat. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat painful. If these things woke up, my 9mm rounds would bounce right off them. I moved to the lab benches, sweeping the beam of light over the clutter. I found a box of nitro gloves, gold dust for sanitation, and a sealed pack of sterile syringes. Then, under a pile of logs, I found a tablet. The battery was swollen, dead, but the sticky note attached to it was legible. Asterisk. Strain Delta exhibits hive mind behavior. Biomass integration imminent. Do not engage at close range. It remembers. Asterisk. It remembers. The words chilled me more than the cold air. I shoved the supplies into my pack and moved on. The stairwell to the sub-basement was blocked by a thick membrane of the black resin, stretching across the landing like a spiderweb made of muscle. I pulled my knife. The blade sliced through it with a wet tearing sound, releasing a puff of sulfurous gas. I coughed, pulling my rebreather up. The air down here was toxic, thick with spores. Level B1. Storage and pharmacy. The Holy Land. The emergency lights here were flickering, casting strobing shadows that made every shape look like a threat. I moved toward the secure storage cage. The chain-link fence had been torn open, not cut. Bent outward. Something big had smashed its way out, not in. I stepped through the breach, scanning the shelves. Looted. Mostly. The panicked buyers and the first wave of looters had taken the obvious stuff, Vicodin, Oxy, Adderall. They left the antibiotics because they didn't think long-term. I swept rows of amoxicillin and doxycycline into my bag. These were lifesavers for infection, for dirty water sickness. Then, the real prize, a refrigerator unit with a backup solar battery, the display dim but active. Insulin. Epinephrine. And my heart skipped. 2 vials of the experimental suppressant. Not a cure, but enough to buy a bitten man 3 days to say goodbye. I grabbed them with trembling hands, wrapping them in padded cloth. Asterisk click. Asterisk. The sound came from the ceiling. It wasn't mechanical. It was the wet click of bones snapping back into place. I froze, killing my light. The darkness was absolute, heavy as water. I listened. Asterisk scrape. Click. Hiss. Asterisk. Above me. In the ventilation ducts. The noise was moving fast, circling. I slowly backed away from the shelves, raising my carbine, aiming blindly into the black. The rumors were right. The infection had moved from the streets to the structure. The building itself felt alive, the hum of the ventilation sounding dangerously like breathing. I triggered the flashlight for a split second, a strobe technique to conserve vision and confuse the target. The beam hit the ceiling. It was clinging to the pipes. A stalker. Limbs elongated, joints reversed like a grasshopper, its skin the color of bruised slate. It had no eyes, just a smooth expanse of callus where the face should be, and a mouth full of needle teeth that split the jaw down to the neck. It had evolved past sight. It was hunting by sound and smell. The light enraged it. It shrieked, a high-frequency tear that vibrated in my teeth, and dropped. I rolled left as it impacted the concrete where I had been standing, cracking the floor tiles. I fired 3 shots, single fire. Asterisk pft, pft, pft. Asterisk the suppressor coughed. 2 rounds hit the shoulder, sparking off the calcified armor. 1 found the soft tissue of the neck, spraying black ichor. It didn't scream this time. It chattered, a rapid-fire clicking sound. Communication. It was calling for help. Move! I whispered to myself. I scrambled over the counter, knocking over a display of braces. The noise was deafening in the silence. The stalker lunged, its elongated arms sweeping across the counter, shredding the metal shelving like wet cardboard. I ducked, feeling the wind of the swing, and sprinted for the exit. The hallway erupted with noise. The vents were rattling. They were coming out of the walls. The resin sacks I had seen earlier, the ones I thought were just growth, began to tear open. Fresh drones, wet and raw, spilled onto the floor. They weren't armored yet, but they were fast. I didn't shoot. I couldn't waste the ammo. I ran. My boots slammed against the linoleum, every step a thunderclap announcing my position. I hit the stairwell, vaulting the railing to skip the flight, landing hard on the landing below. My ankle screamed, but the adrenaline drowned it out. Behind me, the chattering grew into a roar. A hive disturbed. The stalker was leading them. I could hear its claws gouging the concrete as it pursued, faster than the shamblers, intelligent in its malice. I reached the ground floor. The lobby. The light from the street was a gray beacon of hope. But the path was blocked. The security skeleton I had looted earlier was gone. In its place stood a cluster of the infected, dormant until the noise woke them. They turned in unison, their movements jerky, synchronized. I didn't stop. I pulled the pin on a flashbang, my last piece of crowd control, and bolted across the floor. Asterisk bang. Asterisk. The white light was blinding, the concussion thumping against my chest. The infected stumbled, clutching their faces, their sensory link disrupted. I plowed through the gap, shouldering a blinded drone aside, its flesh feeling cold and hard like cured leather. I hit the airlock doors, squeezing through the gap I'd made. The stalker slammed into the metal behind me, a massive impact that dented the steel. A claw, 6 inches long and serrated, swiped through the opening, catching the strap of my backpack. I spun, losing my balance, and jammed the muzzle of the carbine against the claw. I pulled the trigger. The round shattered the joint. The limb retracted with a hiss of pain. I fell backward onto the pavement of the Urban Deadzone. The silence of the city returned instantly, contrasting violently with the chaos inside. I scrambled back, gasping, aiming at the door. Nothing came out. They didn't cross the threshold. Inside the gloom of the lobby, I saw the stalker. It stood just beyond the light, its eyeless face tracking me. It wasn't mindless rage anymore. It was territorial. The research center wasn't just a building, it was a nest. And they were guarding something. I gripped the straps of my bag, feeling the vials of medicine against my spine. I had the loot. I had the intel. But as I limped away into the gray fog of the city, I knew the war had changed. We were fighting the dead before. Now, we were fighting an ecosystem. And it was winning. The airlock hissed, a dying pneumatic gas that shattered the silence of the sector. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, my grip tightening on the scavenger's pry bar, waiting for the sound to draw them in. But the lobby of the Genesis Research Center remained still. Dust motes danced in the pale beam of my tactical light, swirling like microscopic galaxies in the stagnant air. This far into the Urban Deadzone, silence was usually a trap, but the sensors on my wrist were reading clear for motion. It was the biological readings that worried me. The Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a slow metronome of decay, but the biohazard index was spiking into the red. I stepped over the threshold, the glass crunching under my boots sounding like gunshots in a cathedral. The reception desk was a barricade of overturned mahogany and shattered monitors. Behind it lay the first of the bodies. They weren't fresh, dried husks from the initial outbreak 3 years ago, but something was wrong. In the lower zones, the dead rotted. Here, they were preserved calcified. I knelt by a security guard, his face frozen in a silent scream. A web of translucent, fibrous veins ran across his skin, pulsing faintly with a bioluminescent violet hue. This was the evolution. The street-level shamblers were just the carriers. The virus was terraforming the hosts. I bypassed the elevators. Power was long gone, and I didn't trust the emergency brakes. The stairwell was a claustrophobic throat of concrete and steel, the air growing colder as I descended toward the subterranean labs. My objective was specific: broad-spectrum antibiotics, adrenaline injectors, and anything related to the Chimera protocol mentioned in the broadcast fragments we'd intercepted. My community was dying of simple infections while the world outside mutated. I needed the loot. Level B2, Pathology. The heavy fire door had been warped, bent outward as if something massive had rammed it from the inside. I squeezed through the gap, my rebreather filtering out the heavy, copper tang of blood and the sharper, chemical sting of formaldehyde. The corridor stretched out into darkness, lined with observation windows. I moved low, keeping my light focused on the floor to avoid tripping wires or stepping on biological hazards. The first looting opportunity was a nurse's station. I vaulted the counter, sweeping the drawers. Jack popped. 4 sealed blister packs of amoxicillin, a box of sterile gauze, and a handful of morphine ampoules. I shoved them into my pack, wrapping the glass vials in spare socks to silence the clinking. It wasn't enough, though. The good stuff, the heavy-duty antivirals, would be in the secure storage. As I moved deeper, the architecture of the infection became undeniable. The walls here weren't just concrete. They were coated in a thick, resinous secretions that looked like hardened amber. Inside the resin, I could see things: office chairs, clipboards, human limbs, suspended in the matrix. The virus was building a hive. I reached the main lab, a cavernous space filled with smashed centrifuges and overturned incubators. In the center of the room stood a containment unit, the glass shattered. I approached the nearest workstation, wiping grime from a terminal. Miraculously, the backup battery light blinked green. I keyed the power. The screen flickered to life, displaying a final log entry dated 6 months after the fall. Subject 87 has breached containment, the text read. The strain is no longer purely biological. It is assimilating synthetic materials. It is weaponizing the environment. Do not engage. Sealed the facility. A wet, tearing sound echoed from the far corner of the lab. I killed my light instantly, plunging the room into an abyss of shadows. I held my breath, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The noise came again, a wet slap against the linoleum, followed by the screech of metal on metal. I toggled my night vision monocular. The room washed in grain-green static. At the far end, near the broken containment unit, something was moving. It wasn't a walker. It moved on all fours, its limbs elongated and jointed backward like a grasshopper's. But the horror was in the details. The creature was fused with the debris of the lab. Shards of glass served as claws, coiled tubing acted as external muscle fibers. The virus had taken the chimera concept literally, integrating the host with the technology that was meant to cure it. I needed to get to the storage locker behind it. I unclipped a flare from my belt. The creature, Subject 87 or whatever it had become, paused. It didn't have eyes, just a smooth, bulbous mass of scar tissue and sensors where a face should be. It was hunting by sound, or perhaps thermal signatures. I threw the unlit flare to the opposite corner. It clattered loudly. The creature shrieked, a sound like a modem connecting mixed with a human scream, and launched itself across the room with terrifying speed. I sprinted. I didn't look back. I hit the storage locker, jamming my pry bar into the lock. 1 heave. 2. The metal groaned. The shriek came again, closer this time. The door popped open. I didn't have time to sort. I swept the shelves, vials of blue liquid labeled retroviral 4, boxes of syringes, vacuum-sealed trauma kits, dumping them into my duffel. The heavy thud of the creature landing behind me vibrated through the floor. I spun around, raising my modified carbine. The thing stood in the doorway, blocking my exit. Up close, it was a nightmare of biology and industry. A microscope lens was embedded in its shoulder. Fiber optic cables wove through its muscle tissue. It reared up, exposing a chest cavity that glowed with that same violet pulse I'd seen on the corpses upstairs. It was a reactor. I fired. The 5.56 rounds sparked off the metal plating fused to its skin, but the organic bits shredded. It roared, swiping at me. I ducked, feeling the wind of the blow, and scrambled under a lab table. The creature smashed the table in half, but I was already moving, sliding across the slick floor toward the secondary exit. I needed a distraction. I grabbed a beaker of ethanol from a shattered shelf and hurled it at the creature, followed immediately by the lit flare. The chemical fire whooshed into existence, engulfing the beast. It didn't burn like flesh. It burned like plastic and ozone. The creature thrashed, smashing equipment, giving me the window I needed. I burst into the hallway, lungs burning, the weight of the medical supplies dragging me down. I didn't stop for the stairs. I sprinted for the freight elevator shaft, prying the doors open and leaping for the cables. I slid down, the friction burning through my gloves, landing hard on top of the car stuck between floors. The screeching above was joined by others. The hive was waking up. I scrambled out of the shaft into the sub-basement parking garage. The light of day, gray, filtered through smoke, poured in from the collapsed ramp. I hit the sunlight just as the first of the fast movers burst from the stairwell behind me. I ran until the research center was a tombstone on the horizon. I collapsed in the ruins of a coffee shop 3 blocks away, checking my haul. The blue vials glinted in the dim light. We had the cure, or at least a treatment. But as I looked at my arm, where a small cut from the fall was bleeding, I saw the blood wasn't quite red. It was darker. And for a second, just a second, I thought I saw a violet pulse beneath the skin. The evolution wasn't just happening to them. It was happening to us. We were just adapting slower. The airlock cycled with a groan of dying hydraulics, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the urban dead zone. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable shriek of the infected, but only the low, thrumming bass of the city's decaying power grid answered. I was inside the Aegis Biosolutions facility. On the maps, this place was a black void, redacted, erased, non-existent. In reality, it was a concrete monolith rising from the ashes of Sector 4, a monument to the hubris that had doomed us all. I adjusted the straps of my rucksack, the nylon biting into my shoulders, and clicked on my mag light. The beam cut through the swirling dust motes, illuminating a lobby that looked more like a battlefield than a place of science. Reception desks were overturned, barricades of filing cabinets and ergonomic chairs had been smashed apart by something possessing inhuman strength. And the floor was a mosaic of shattered safety glass and dried, blackened ichor. My priority was Level 4, virology and containment. That's where the high-grade suppressors would be. We were running low on antivirals at the safe house, and without them, a scratch was a death sentence. I moved toward the stairwell, avoiding the elevators, metal coffins waiting to trap the careless. The air inside tasted metallic, recycled too many times, carrying the faint, sweet scent of ozone and rot. It was the smell of the new world. As I ascended, I kept my suppressed carbine tight against my shoulder, clearing corners with the methodical paranoia that had kept me alive for 3 years. The stairwell was surprisingly clear, save for a few bodies huddled in corners. They were desiccated, mummified by the climate control system that was miraculously, impossibly, still running on emergency power. I knelt by a corpse in a lab coat, checking the pockets. Nothing but a melted ID badge and a photo of a family that probably didn't exist anymore. But it was the body itself that gave me pause. The skin wasn't just dried, it was calcified. Hard gray patches, like barnacles, clustered around the throat and hands. This wasn't the standard necrosis. This was armor. I pushed the thought away and kept climbing. Level 3 was admin and Level 4 was the payload. The door to the virology department was sealed, a heavy magnetic lock displaying a red LED. I pulled the bypass kit from my belt, a mess of wires and a crude battery pack scavenged from electric scooters. It took 2 minutes of sweating over exposed circuitry before the light turned green and the mag lock disengaged with a heavy clunk. I pushed the door open and stepped into a different world. Unlike the chaos below, this hallway was pristine. The emergency lighting bathed everything in a sterile, amber glow. The silence here was heavier, pressurized. I moved past windowless labs, checking the inventory lists on the wall plaques. Viral propagation, host adaptation, chimera protocols. The name sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I found the primary storage locker at the end of the hall. The glass was reinforced, but the keypad was dead. I used the butt of my rifle to shatter the corner, carefully picking away the shards until I could reach through and unlock it from the inside. Jackpot. Rows of amber vials, blister packs of broad-spectrum antibiotics, and crucially, 3 boxes of Z-suppressant, the experimental variety. I swept them into my bag, wrapping the glass vials in rags to silence the clinking. My heart was hammering. This haul could buy the safe house 6 months of stability. I should have turned back then. I should have taken the win and run. But greed is a survivor's worst enemy, and curiosity is its accomplice. I saw the light flickering in the adjacent lab, Sector 4B. Through the observation window, I saw monitors active, scrolling data. Someone, or something, had been here recently. I pushed into the room, weapon raised. The lab was dominated by a massive cylindrical tank in the center, filled with a cloudy, viscous green fluid. Inside the tank, that was where the nightmare began. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. It was a man, stripped of clothing, suspended in the suspension gel, but his anatomy had been rewritten. The calcification I'd seen on the corpse in the stairwell was fully realized here. Plates of bone-like armor covered the chest and forearms. The fingers had fused and elongated into scythe-like claws. But the worst part was the head. The jaw had unhinged, splitting down the center of the neck, and sensory tendrils, like the antennae of a moth, floated in the liquid where eyes should have been. I stepped closer to the console, my boots squeaking on the linoleum. The screen displayed a log entry dated 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. The world ended 3 years ago. Who was writing this? I hit the playback button. A voice, raspy and dry, crackled through the speakers. Subject 82 shows promising integration with the theta strain. The mycelial network is no longer just hijacking the nervous system, it is enhancing it. The host is not dead. The host is improved. We were wrong to think of this as a disease. It is an evolution. A forced adaptation to a dying biosphere. The armor is impervious to small arms fire. The sensory organs detect heat and vibration through solid walls. My blood ran cold. I looked back at the tank. The fluid was swirling. The tendrils on the creature's face twitched. It wasn't dead. It was incubating. And then I saw the cables running from the tank to the other pods in the room, pods I hadn't noticed in the shadows. There were a dozen of them. All occupied. All evolving. A sharp hiss of steam erupted from the main tank's pressure release valve. The vitals monitor spiked red. Wake cycle initiated, the computer droned in a pleasant, synthetic voice. I didn't wait. I spun on my heel, sprinting for the door. Behind me, the sound of wet, tearing meat and shattering glass erupted. The creature had broken the tank. I hit the hallway, my boots skidding, and heard a shriek that sounded like grinding metal. It wasn't the mindless moan of a shambler. It was a predatory war cry. I raised my rifle and fired blindly behind me. The hallway lit up with a muzzle flash. I saw it, a blur of wet gray armor and whipping tendrils scuttling along the walls and ceiling like a spider. My round sparked off its carapace useless. Movement detected in Sector 4, the building's PA system announced. Containment breach. Locking down. Heavy blast doors began to descend from the ceiling, sealing the corridor segments. I was 50 meters from the stairwell. The first door slammed down behind me, cutting off the view of the creature, but I could hear it pounding against the steel, denting it. I slid under the second door just as it hit the floor, the metal scraping my rucksack. I scrambled up, lungs burning, and burst into the stairwell just as the final blast door sealed the level. I didn't stop running until I hit the lobby. I vaulted the reception desk, ignoring the laceration on my palm as I landed on a shard of glass. The building was waking up around me, alarms blaring, red lights strobing. I hit the airlock, slamming the cycle button. It felt like an eternity. The inner door sealed, and the hiss of decontamination filled the small chamber. Through the thick glass of the inner door, I looked back into the lobby. The elevator doors pinged open. 3 of them stepped out. Not the tank creature, but the lesser evolutions. Their skin was like bark, their eyes gone, replaced by those twitching feelers. They didn't shuffle. They moved with terrifying, fluid grace, heads cocking as they hunted for the vibration of my heartbeat. The outer door hissed open. I stumbled out into the gray light of the dead zone, the humid, rotting air filling my lungs. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in the ruin of an old subway station 3 blocks away. I clutched a bag of medicine to my chest, gasping for air. We had the antibiotics. We had the suppressors. But we had lost the war. The virus wasn't just killing us anymore. It was replacing us. The things in that lab weren't zombies. They were the future. And we were just the endangered species waiting to be hunted. The silhouette of the Ethelgard Medical Research Center cut through the toxic smog of the Urban Deadzone like a jagged tombstone. It was a monolith of shattered glass and blackened steel, standing silent amidst the cacophony of the city's decay. I adjusted the straps of my rucksack, the nylon biting into my shoulders, and checked the seal on my gas mask. The dead zone wasn't just dangerous because of the infected. The air here tasted of copper and sulfur. A chemical cocktail left behind when the military firebombed the grid in the early days. I wasn't here for sightseeing. Rumors in the survivor encampments whispered of a cache that hadn't been picked clean, high-grade antibiotics, surgical tools, maybe even adrenaline. In a world where a scratch could mean a fever death, this place was El Dorado. I skirted the perimeter, avoiding the main entrance where a pile of barricaded cars had become a rusting monument to a failed evacuation. The side service door, heavy and reinforced, had been pried open just enough for a human body to squeeze through. The metal groaned as I slipped inside, the sound echoing like a gunshot in a cathedral. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of old dust and something sweeter, the cloying scent of dormant mold. I clicked on my shoulder lamp, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a hallway lined with stretchers. They were empty now, save for the dark, flaking stains that mapped the final moments of the patients who had died waiting. I moved slowly, keeping my weight on the balls of my feet. The floor was tiled with linoleum that had peeled back like dead skin, revealing the concrete beneath. My first stop was the intake station. The desk was a chaotic mess of papers, overturned monitors, and shattered landlines. I sifted through the debris, my gloved fingers brushing over patient intake forms dated 5 years ago. Fever, aggression, calcification. That last word made me pause. Calcification. The early strains of the pathogen Z turned people into shambling sacks of rotting meat, driven by hunger and rage. But the virus was a living thing, and living things adapt. I swept a drawer into my bag, a handful of sterile gauze, a box of latex gloves, and a half-empty bottle of isopropyl alcohol. Small treasures. I pushed deeper into the facility, moving past the waiting rooms and into the secure wings. The biometric locks were dead, the magnetic seals failing when the backup generators finally choked out years ago. The silence was absolute, which terrified me more than the noise. Noise meant you knew where the threat was. Silence meant it was hunting you. I reached the observation deck overlooking the lower labs. The glass here was thick, ballistic grade, but it was spiderwebbed with impact fractures. I shone my light down into the pit. The lab below was a slaughterhouse, but it was the specimens that froze the breath in my lungs. Lying on the dissection tables were bodies that defied the standard taxonomy of the infected. One corpse had fused with a metal table, bone spurs erupting from its spine to anchor it in place. Another had its arms elongated, the fingers fused into singular, scythe-like bone blades. This was the evolution. The virus wasn't just reanimating dead tissue anymore. It was restructuring it, optimizing the host for violence. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat painful. I needed to get down there. The pharmacy storage was on that level. I found the stairwell, the door hanging off one hinge. The descent was a journey into the belly of the beast. The temperature dropped, the air growing colder and damper. I reached the bottom landing and stepped into the lab. Up close, the evolved looked even worse. The skin on the creature fused to the table was gray and hard, like cured leather. I gave it a wide berth, my hand hovering over the grip of my suppressed pistol. I found the secure storage cage at the far end of the room. The gate was locked, but the chain-link fencing had rusted through near the floor. I pulled out my bolt cutters, the metallic snips sounding deafeningly loud. I froze, waiting. Nothing. I peeled back the fence and crawled inside. It was a gold mine. Rows of untouched pharmaceuticals. Amoxicillin, oxycodone, epinephrine. I started sweeping armfuls into my pack, greedy but efficient. I grabbed a sealed box of 4 bags, saline solution, worth its weight in gold for dehydration. I was zipping the bags shut when I heard it. A clicking sound. Wet and guttural. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the table. I spun around, my light catching the dissection table I had passed earlier. The thing, the fused monstrosity, was moving. It didn't moan. It didn't breathe. It vibrated. The bone spurs anchoring it to the table cracked and snapped as it tore itself free, leaving chunks of its own torso behind. It hit the floor with a wet thud, standing on legs that were bowed and reinforced with external ossification. It had no eyes, just a smooth plate of bone where the upper face should be. It clicked again, tilting its head. Echolocation. It was blind, but it could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. I drew my pistol, aiming for the center of mass, knowing a headshot might just ricochet off that bone plate. The creature let out a shriek that wasn't human, a high-pitched frequency that made my teeth ache. It lunged. I fired twice. The bullets sparked off its chest, the rounds flattening against the calcified armor beneath its skin. The impact staggered it, but didn't stop it. It was fast, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. I scrambled back, knocking over a tray of surgical tools. The noise was like a dinner bell. The creature swiped at me, its fused bone claw tearing through the sleeve of my jacket, missing my skin by millimeters. I kicked out, my boot connecting with its knee, hoping to shatter the joint. It felt like kicking a concrete pillar. I turned and ran. I vaulted over a lab bench, glass speakers shattering under my boots. The creature crashed through the bench behind me, wood and metal splintering like balsa. It wasn't just strong, it was a battering ram. I sprinted for the stairwell, my lungs burning. The clicking was right behind me, a frantic staccato rhythm. I reached the stairs and took them two at a time, risking a broken ankle in the dark. Below me, I heard the creature slam into the doorframe, wedging itself for a moment before tearing through. I burst onto the ground floor, the adrenaline flooding my system. But I wasn't alone anymore. The shriek had woken the others. From the shadows of the waiting room, figures began to rise. They weren't the armored tank below, but they were different too, faster, twitchier. Runners. Their skin was translucent, veins black with the virus, muscles coiled tight. I didn't stop to fight. I lowered my shoulder and slammed into the service door, tumbling out into the rain-slicked alley. I scrambled to my feet, slipping in the mud, and ran. I didn't look back until I was 3 blocks away, lungs heaving, the toxic rain mingling with the sweat on my face. I collapsed behind a dumpster, clutching my pack. I had the medicine. I had the supplies. But as I sat there, listening to the distant, rhythmic clicking echoing from the facility, I realized the terrifying truth. We were surviving, scavenging the scraps of the old world. But they were improving. The deadlock was breaking, and we were losing the arms race. The airlock hissed, a dying breath of a hydraulic seal that hadn't held true pressure in months. The interior of the Genesis Medical Solutions Tower smelled of sterilized death, bleach undertones buried under the copper tang of old blood and the sickly, sweet scent of advanced biological decay. My boots crunched on safety glass as I stepped out of the decontamination chamber and into the atrium. This was the Urban Deadzone, the red sector where the bombing runs had failed, and this building was the epicenter. I adjusted the strap of my respirator, the rubber biting into my sweat-slicked skin. The Geiger counter clipped to my belt clicked rhythmically, a slow, steady heartbeat warning of the low-level radiation that permeated the city center, but it was the silence that unnerved me most. In the outskirts, the infected moaned and shuffled. Here, in the dark heart of the zone, they had stopped making noise. I swept the beam of my tactical light across the lobby. It was a mausoleum of corporate ambition. The reception desk was barricaded with overturned mahogany tables and Herman Miller chairs, a futile fortification against the initial outbreak. Behind the barricade lay the desiccated remains of the security team, their armor torn open like tin cans. I moved past them, keeping my carbine tucked tight into my shoulder. My objective was the Level 4 containment wing on the 14th floor. Rumors from the shortwave radio network suggested Genesis had been synthesizing a broad-spectrum antibiotic before the grid went down, gold dust in a world where a simple scratch could mean sepsis and death, even without the virus. Scavenging in the dead zone required a different mindset. You didn't just grab everything, you had to be surgical. Weight was death. Speed was life. I bypassed the scattered pistols on the floor, Glocks with empty slides, and focused on the environment. The elevators were dead tombs, their shafts likely clogged with bodies, so I headed for the emergency stairwell. The door was jammed, the steel warped as if something massive had rammed it from the other side. I wedged my crowbar into the gap, groaning with exertion as the metal shrieked, a sound too loud for this quiet place. The door popped open, revealing a stairwell draped in shadow and something else. My light caught the walls. They weren't concrete anymore. A thick, gray webbing covered the masonry, pulsing faintly. This was the evolution the survival networks whispered about. The virus wasn't just reanimating dead tissue. It was adapting, creating a biosphere. I stepped over a tangled root mass that looked suspiciously like fused human intestines and began the climb. On the 6th floor, the webbing grew thicker, sprouting bulbous, translucent sacs that glowed with a faint bioluminescence. I avoided them. The last thing I needed was to inhale spores from a mutated fungal strain. By the 10th floor, my legs burned, and the air inside my mask felt stale. I paused on the landing to check my gear. Half a magazine of 5.56, 3 flares, a combat knife, and an empty canvas duffel bag waiting to be filled. I pushed open the door to the 12th floor, needing a shortcut through the labs to reach the containment wing elevator bank. The scene that greeted me was a frozen tableau of panic. Lab coats hung on hooks, coffee mugs sat with moldering liquid inside, and monitors were dark. But the center of the room was dominated by a shattered observation tank. Thick glass, 3 inches of polycarbonate, had been blown outward. I crept through the rows of workbenches, my eyes scanning for loot. I found a cache of sealed saline bags, useless weight, and a box of nitro gloves. I took the gloves. Then, near the back, I struck pay dirt. A refrigeration unit, its backup battery long dead, but the thermal insulation had held. I cracked the seal. The smell of spoiled chemical agents wafted out, but on the bottom shelf, sitting in a plastic tray, were 6 vials of epinephrine and a sealed box of Z-Pack antibiotics. My hands trembled as I swept them into my bag, wrapping the glass vials and rags to prevent clinking. This was months of survival right here. This was leverage. As I zipped the bag, a sound froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a groan. It was a chittering, clicking noise, like wet stones being struck together. It came from the ceiling. I slowly directed my light upward. The drop ceiling tiles were gone, exposing the HVAC ducts and steel beams. Clinging to the metalwork, upside down, was a horror that defied the early taxonomy of the infected. It was humanoid, but its limbs had elongated, the joints reversed. Its skin had hardened into a chitinous, gray armor, matching the webbing in the stairwell. The eyes were gone, replaced by a smooth, calcified plate over the upper face. It was blind, evolving to hunt by sound in the dark corridors of the dead zone. I didn't breathe. The clicker cocked its head, the calcified plate twitching. It had heard the zipper. The virus had stripped away its humanity and replaced it with predatory efficiency. It dropped from the ceiling, landing silently on its hands and feet, moving with the jerky, unnerving speed of a spider. I slowly reached for the flare on my belt, my thumb hovering over the striker. The creature clicked again, a rapid-fire echolocation. It turned its head toward me. It had a lock. I ripped the flare cap and struck it. Magnesium ignited with a blinding red brilliance. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched sound that vibrated in my teeth, and recoiled, thrashing at the sudden heat and light. I didn't wait to see if it burned. I bolted. I vaulted a lab bench, glass crunching under my boots, abandoning stealth for velocity. The creature roared behind me, a wet, guttural sound that signaled the chase was on. I hit the hallway, sprinting toward the stairwell. The webbing on the wall seemed to react to the noise, the bioluminescent sacs pulsing faster, turning an angry crimson. I slammed into the stairwell door, but more chittering echoed from above and below. It wasn't alone. The hive was waking up. I reversed course, heading for the 14th floor access via the maintenance ladder and the shaft I had bypassed earlier. I slid down the hallway, firing 2 shots behind me blindly to suppress the pursuit. The muzzle flash illuminated the corridor for a split second, revealing 3 more of the armored variants scuttling along the walls and ceiling. They were faster than the shamblers, smarter, coordinated. I reached the maintenance hatch, spinning the wheel lock. Rust fought me, but adrenaline won. The door swung open, and I threw myself into the dark shaft of a service elevator, grabbing the oily cables. I slid down, the friction burning through my gloves, dropping past floor 13, 12, 11. Above me, the hatch slammed open, and I heard the scrabbling of claws on metal. They were coming down the cables. I braked hard at the 8th floor, kicking the doors open with a desperate boot. I tumbled into a server room, the air frigid and humming with the ghost of electricity. I scrambled to my feet and barricaded the doors with a heavy server rack, tipping it over with a crash that echoed like thunder. The creature slammed against the steel doors a second later, denting the metal, but the obstruction held. For now. I collapsed against the desk, gasping for air, clutching the bag of antibiotics to my chest. I checked the contents. The vials were intact. I had the loot. But as I looked around the room, I saw a whiteboard covered in frantic scribbles, the final notes of the engineers who died here. One phrase stood out, circled in red marker, asterisk. Subject 86 shows integration with fungal hosts. Hive mind latency confirmed. It's not a disease anymore. It's a terraforming event. Asterisk. The banging on the door stopped, replaced by that terrifying, rhythmic clicking. They weren't trying to break in anymore. They were communicating. They were calling for backup. I reloaded my carbine, the metallic click of the magazine seething loud in the silence. The infection hadn't just destroyed the world. It was building a new one, and I was just a foreign contaminant in its immune system. I stood up, checked the exit route on the wall map, and prepared to move. The dead zone didn't give up its treasures easily, and the way out was going to be a lot harder than the way in. The airlock hissed, a sound like a dying breath that had been held for 3 years, breaking the oppressive silence of the Urban Deadzone. I shouldn't have been here. The Helios Medical Research Center was a tomb. A monolith of concrete and rebar wrapped in the twisted skeletal remains of a city that had burned long before it rotted. But the rumors whispered in the trading posts of Sector 4 were too specific to ignore: military-grade antibiotics, synthesized adrenaline, and clean filtration units. Desperation makes you deaf to the warning bells ringing in your gut, so I pushed through the decontamination mist. My gas mask clinging tight to my sweat-slicked face, and stepped into the sterile white hell of the lobby. The reception area was a frozen tableau of the panic that had struck on day 0. Overturned chairs formed meaningless barricades. The floor was a mosaic of shattered safety glass and dried, blackened slurry that used to be blood. I kept my carbine tight against my shoulder, the flashlight attachment cutting a narrow cone through the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Scavenging isn't just about grabbing what you see, it's about reading the history of the room. The lack of bullet holes in the walls suggested the breach here hadn't been violent, it had been internal. That was the first red flag. If the perimeter held, why was everyone dead? I moved to the reception desk, my boots crunching softly on scattered paperwork. I didn't look at the names on the ID badges. It's easier if they stay ghosts. I checked the drawers first. Junk. Dried out pens, a photo of a golden retriever, a stash of breath mints. But in the bottom drawer, under a frantic mess of evacuation protocols, I found a master keycard. The magnetic strip was likely demagnetized by time and radiation, but the physical chip might still work on the secure wings. I bypassed the elevators, coffins waiting to plummet, and took the service stairs down. The air grew colder, heavier, smelling of ozone and formaldehyde. This deep in the dead zone, the infection does strange things. Upstairs, the shamblers are just hungry mouths on rotting legs, decaying until they can't move. But down here, in the dark and the damp, shielded from the UV radiation of the surface, the biomass doesn't just rot. It changes. It adapts. I reached sub-level 3, virology and containment. The heavy blast door was slightly ajar, jammed by a gurney with a body bag strapped to it. I squeezed through, the nylon of my gear scraping against the metal. The hallway beyond was lined with observation windows. I swept my light across the first room. Empty. The second room contained shattered centrifuges. The third room made me stop cold. The glass was reinforced, 3 inches of polycarbonate, but it was spiderwebbed with cracks from the inside. Smeared against the pane was a residue that glowed faintly luminescent under my beam, fungal, pulsating. I stepped closer, wiping the condensation from my mask. The corpse inside wasn't human anymore, not in the way we understood the infected. It hadn't decayed, it had calcified. Massive, bone-like spurs had erupted through the flesh of the shoulders and forearms, fusing into natural armor plates. The jaw had unhinged and reset, creating a maw twice the size of a normal human's, lined with serrated calcium deposits. This was the evolution the Deep Zone runners whispered about. The virus wasn't just killing the host, it was fortifying it. It was building a better predator. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and moved on. The prize was the cold storage vault at the end of the hall. The looting protocol is simple. Prioritize sealed containers, check expiration codes, never turn your back on a vent. I reached the vault door. The electronic lock was dead, but the manual override wheel was intact. I holstered my weapon, grabbing the cold steel with both hands. It groaned, a screech of metal on metal that echoed like a gunshot in the silent corridor. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs, listening. Nothing but the hum of the backup generators that had miraculously survived. I heaved again, and the door swung open. The blast of freezing air fogged my mask instantly. I wiped it clear, stepping into the promised land. Rows of stainless steel shelves lined the room. I pulled my pack off, my hands shaking as I unzipped the main compartment. This was it. I swept armfuls of boxed amoxicillin, sealed trauma kits, and vials of epinephrine into the bag. I found a heavy, plastic case marked Biohazard, Strain Delta. I hesitated. Information is currency, sometimes more valuable than meds. I shoved it into the bottom of the pack. Then I heard it. A wet clicking sound. Not from the hallway, but from the ceiling of the vault. I slowly raised my flashlight. The ventilation grate above me was gone. Crouched in the ductwork, staring down with milk-white eyes that lacked pupils, was one of the calcified horrors. It didn't moan. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve. It dropped. I threw myself backward as the creature landed where I had been standing a second ago, the impact cracking the floor tiles. Up close, the smell was atrocious, not rot, but chemical sweetness, like overripe fruit and bleach. It lunged, faster than any shambler I'd ever seen. I scrambled back, fumbling for my carbine. The creature's arm, encased in that jagged bone armor, swept out and caught the barrel of my rifle, tearing it from my grip and sending it skittering across the room. I scrambled for my sidearm, the 9mm feeling like a toy against this monstrosity. The thing roared, a guttural sound that vibrated in my chest, and charged. I fired 3 rounds. 2 sparked harmlessly off the bone plate protecting its chest. The third punched into the soft tissue of its neck, spraying black ichor. It didn't even slow down. It slammed into me, pinning me against the steel shelving. The air left my lungs. I could see the pores on its gray skin, the way the virus had woven fibers through its muscle to reinforce it. This wasn't random mutation. This was engineered. The scientists here, they hadn't been trying to cure it. They were trying to weaponize it. It snapped its jaws, inches from my face. I jammed my left forearm into its throat, the bite guard of my armor screeching under the pressure. With my right hand, I reached for the flare attached to my vest. I ripped the cap off and jammed the burning magnesium stick into the open wound on its neck. The creature shrieked, a sound that wasn't human, as the flare burned cauterized flesh and bone from the inside. It thrashed, throwing me to the side. I scrambled across the ice-slick floor, grabbing my carbine. The creature was flailing, pawing at the fire embedded in its throat. I didn't hesitate. I aimed for the eye socket, the only soft point left on its armored skull, and squeezed the trigger. The back of its head blew out in a spray of bone and black sludge. It collapsed, twitching. I lay there for a moment, gasping, the adrenaline crash making my limbs feel like lead. I looked at the corpse. The bone armor was still growing, even after death, shifting slightly as the virus tried to repair the damage. I grabbed my pack, the weight of the loot heavy on my shoulders. I had to go. The screeching had echoed. The rest of the facility would be waking up. I sprinted back through the corridor, the silence replaced by the distant sound of banging on metal doors. The hive was stirred. As I reached the stairwell, I saw the observation windows rattling. Handprints, dozens of them, were smearing the glass from the inside. They knew I was here. I took the stairs 2 at a time, lungs burning, the weight of the strained delta case digging into my spine. I burst into the lobby just as the elevator doors dinged open. I didn't wait to see what came out. I hit the sunlight of the Urban Deadzone, the gray light of a nuclear winter blinding me. I didn't stop running until I was 3 blocks away, collapsed in the ruin of an old coffee shop. I checked the loot. The meds were real. I was rich. But then I looked at the case marked Strain Delta. I cracked it open. Inside wasn't a vial, but a logbook. I flipped to the final entry, dated 3 days after the fall. Subject 84 shows promise. The osseous reinforcement is resisting small arms fire. Integration with the fungal host is complete. We are no longer containing the infection. We are perfecting the soldier of the next century. God forgive us. I closed the book. The evolution wasn't nature reclaiming the earth. It was us. It was always us. I packed the book away, checked the load in my magazine, and looked out at the skyline. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that looked too much like the things I'd just left behind. The dead zone was changing, evolving into something sharper, harder, and hungrier. And we were just meat waiting to be processed. The pry bar groaned against the galvanized steel of the service entrance, a screech that sounded like a dinner bell in the silent, suffocating humidity of the Urban Deadzone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm syncing with the distant, wet thud of my own pulse in my ears. The heavy door finally gave way with a pneumatic hiss, the magnetic locks dying years ago, but the seal holding on out of sheer stubbornness. I slipped inside, instantly enveloped by the smell. It wasn't the earthy, decomposing stench of the streets outside. The medical research center smelled of ozone, stale antiseptic, and something coppery, like old, dried blood baked under fluorescent lights. I clicked my headlamp to the lowest red light setting. The beam cut through the swirling dust motes, illuminating a hallway lined with gurneys. They were occupied. Desiccated corpses, wrists zip-tied to the rails, mouths frozen in silent screams. This was where the triage had failed. I moved past them, boots crunching softly on shattered glass and discarded clipboards. My focus was singular: the pharmacy storage on the 3rd floor and the containment labs in the basement. The rumors in the survivor enclaves spoke of a strain evolution, whispers that the dead weren't just rotting anymore, they were changing. I needed antibiotics, sure, but I needed information more. The stairwell was a choke point of barricaded furniture and tangled bodies, so I took the maintenance ladder up the elevator shaft. The cables swayed in the draft, clinking softly against the concrete walls. On the third floor, I pried the doors open and stepped into the administrative wing. It was a labyrinth of cubicles and smashed monitors. I began the scavenge, my movements practiced and efficient. I bypassed the standard gauze and saline. I was here for the heavy hitters. In a locked supervisor's office, I found a stash of epinephrine injectors and a box of broad-spectrum antibiotics, gold dust. I swept them into my pack, the clatter of plastic vials sounding dangerously loud. But it was the whiteboard on the wall that froze me. Beneath a layer of grime, frantic handwriting detailed patient vitals. Subject 402, necrosis halted. Calcification of the dermis observed. Aggression levels rising. Specimen is learning. Learning. The words sat heavy in my gut. The shamblers outside didn't learn. They just consumed. I left the office and moved toward the secured wing, the biosafety level 4 signs painted in ominous red warnings on the floor. The heavy blast doors were open, jammed by a forklift that had run out of battery mid-escape. Beyond the threshold, the environment changed. The walls were lined with a thick, black resin, organic residue that looked like dried tar but felt spongy to the touch. This wasn't decay, it was growth. I reached the observation deck overlooking the main lab. Below, the containment cells were shattered. Glass littered the floor like diamonds. In the center of the room, a centrifuge lay on its side, and next to it, a pile of what looked like molted skin. Not human skin, something thicker, gray and rigid, like the carapace of a crab. I rappelled down into the lab, my boots slipping on the slick resin. The air here was colder, biting at the exposed skin of my neck. I approached a terminal that was still flickering with emergency power. I tapped the keys, bringing up the last log entry. The pathogen is adapting to the host's decay. The voice of a terrified researcher crackled through the speakers, making me jump. I lowered the volume instantly, hand hovering over my sidearm. It's repurposing the skeletal structure. We thought it was a virus. It's not. It's a biological architect. It reinforces the bone density, fusing the ribcage into a solid plate. It's armoring them. A sound from the shadows cut the recording short. It wasn't a moan. It was a click. A wet, guttural clicking sound, like stones grinding together underwater. I killed my light. The darkness was absolute, save for the blinking amber LED of the server tower. The clicking grew louder, rhythmic. It was coming from the ventilation shaft above the broken containment unit. I backed away slowly, stepping over the debris with agonizing care, but a shard of a beaker crunched under my heel. The reaction was instantaneous. The vent grate exploded outward, and something dropped to the floor with a heavy, metallic thud. I flicked my light back on, the beam catching the creature. It stood on two legs, but its posture was wrong, hunched, predatory. It was once human, wearing the tattered remains of a hazmat suit, but the skin had turned a mottled, stone gray. The chest was a solid mass of calcified bone, the ribs fused together to form a natural breastplate. Its jaw was unhinged, hanging loose, and from the mouth, a secondary set of mandibles, formed from mutated finger bones, twitched. It didn't shamble. It sprinted. I fired 3 rounds center mass. The bullets sparked off the bone-plate chest, ricocheting harmlessly into the darkness. The creature didn't even flinch. It slammed into me, driving the wind from my lungs and sending me sliding across the resin-slicked floor. The strength behind the blow was hydraulic, unnatural. I scrambled back, my pistol skittering away. The creature let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal and lunged again. I rolled, grabbing a heavy microscope from a nearby table and swinging it with everything I had. It connected with the creature's head, shattering the lens but only staggering the beast. It swiped at me, jagged claws tearing through my jacket and grazing my shoulder. Pain flared, hot and sharp. I kicked out, connecting with its knee. The joint buckled with a sickening crunch, but it didn't break. This thing was reinforced. I needed a soft spot. The eyes. The virus couldn't armor the eyes. I drew my combat knife, the blade looking pathetically small against this monstrosity. The creature recovered, clicking furiously, and charged. I held my ground until the last second, then dropped to my knees, sliding between its legs. As I passed underneath, I drove the knife upward into the soft tissue of the inner thigh, twisting it. Black, viscous fluid sprayed out, acidic and steaming. The creature howled, a sound that vibrated in my teeth, and thrashed wildly. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed a canister of liquid nitrogen from a storage rack. The seal was intact. I didn't think, I just hurled it at the creature. The heavy tank hit the calcified chest plate. I raised my pistol, retrieved from the floor in the scramble, and aimed not at the beast, but at the tank. One shot. The canister ruptured. A cloud of supercooled gas exploded outward, enveloping the creature instantly. The clicking turned into a frozen, strangled rasp. The black resin on the floor hissed and cracked. The creature froze mid-lunge, its armored skin frosting over, the biological imperative to kill slowed by the absolute zero bite. It wasn't dead, but it was sluggish, its joints grinding audibly as the fluids inside crystallized. I didn't wait to see if it would thaw. I ran. I sprinted back to the elevator shaft, adrenaline overriding the burn in my shoulder. I vaulted up the maintenance ladder, slipping twice, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Below me, the clicking started again, slower but persistent. It was still coming. I burst out of the service entrance, and into the humid night air of the dead zone. I slammed the door and jammed the pry bar through the handles, twisting it until the metal warped. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would hold long enough. I collapsed against the brickwork, checking my loot. The antibiotics were safe. The epinephrine was safe. But the real weight in my pack was the hard drive I had ripped from the server tower in the chaos. The infection wasn't just spreading anymore. It was fortifying. The things in the city were the infantry, the cannon fodder. What I had just fought was a tank. And if nature, or whatever hellish science created this, was building tanks, Then the war for survival had just shifted into a phase we weren't ready for. I looked out at the skyline, the fires burning in the distance. The shadows seemed deeper now, the silence of the city less like peace and more like an ambush waiting to spring. I adjusted my pack, gripped my weapon, and moved into the dark. The scavenger hunt was over. The arms race had begun.